the way I would put it is that there are some things that a government could do better than the alternatives, but that I know of no way of setting up a government which will do only those things and do them in the way it ought to do and not do other and worse things as well.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast number 160. And this episode is with David Friedman, who's Professor Emeritus at the Santa Clara University School of Law. And while David was trained as a physicist, perhaps this was inevitable because his father was the esteemed Nobel laureate Milton Friedman. David has become an economist and is best known for his work in economics and particularly his defense of Anarcho-Capitalism, which is, I suppose I don't know how I should be classifying it, as an economic theory of some sort or a political philosophy, but I think I'll stick with the political philosophy that advocates for a sort of a free market economy that is unhampered by government or governmental influence. And in this episode, that is pretty much all that we discuss. We get into some criticisms of current economic systems, the variety of anarchism, the arguments for anarcho-capitalism, some potential criticisms or problems. Like I don't really see how less government is going to help solve problems like climate change. And then we also talk about one of David's very fascinating hobbies, which is called Anachronism, and which I had never heard of before talking with David about it. So that's at the end of the episode and very exciting. So you should also check out David's website, which is daviddfriedman.com, his Substack, which you can also find there, and then The Machinery of Freedom, Guide to a Radical Capitalism, which is his book that goes over everything anarcho-capitalism and has gone through multiple versions at this point. So likes, comments, subscribes, reviews, follows, love them all, can't get too many of them all, keep them coming. And now, without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with David. I'd like to spend the bulk of our time today talking about your current views, but I think the best way to introduce them is probably by starting with what or where they came from. And I know that you weren't officially trained as an economist, but as a physicist, yet your father was the renowned economist Milton Friedman. And I'm wondering whether you emerged from under his wing as a proponent of the free market, or like other children, you began rebellious and maybe your first foray into economics.
I wasn't particularly rebellious. I eventually concluded that he was a little bit of a socialist, that he wanted a little bit more government than I did. But no, I would say that on the whole, I mostly agree with my father's views. And I never studied economics. That is, I never took an economics course for credit. But of course, we talked economics. I mean, I think I can claim to have invented consumer surplus, for example, probably when I was in high school, maybe college, in the sense of seeing the idea of it. And I, at one point, a good deal later, pointed out to my father, he's got a very, very clever article on the optimal quantity of money. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it shows that there is a sense in which you really want declining price level. Maybe you're not. Apparently, it's a fairly well-known article, which I didn't realize, so I looked it up a couple of days ago. But the argument is that the private cost of holding money is the interest rate. The social cost of holding money is close to zero because the law of large numbers averages the variations in people's desired wealth holdings out. And in order to equilibrate the social and the private costs of holding money, you need to have an interest rate close to zero, a nominal interest rate close to zero, which you get by having prices declining at the real interest rate. And I pointed out to my father that that was precisely the result you would get in a competitive free banking system with competitive fractional reserve banks, all of which held fractions very close to zero. And if you assume that you can ignore their actual operating costs. So that was an economic insight, as you like, probably made before I was nominally an economist. I can't time it very accurately. But no, I think the main place where there was, in a sense, a conflict, but it was with my views as well as my father's, was on the question of whether governments had any rights. That on the one hand, I felt, as I think my father felt, that although the market is a wonderful system, it has to have a framework of enforced law to operate within, and that has to be produced from the outside, as it were. And I eventually concluded that that wasn't true, that you could plausibly imagine institutions in which the framework was itself endogenous. And I discovered much later that not only could you plausibly imagine them, there have been a variety of historical societies in which the legal system was not provided by the state. So in that sense, I sometimes claim that when I did the work that led to my most recent book, I discovered that in my first book, I had been reinventing the wheel. That I had been imagining a modern society version of something which had existed in much more primitive societies in the past.
So it sounds like if you were having some of these conversations in high school, you were a very precocious teenager and economist.
I went to Harvard when I was 16.
Okay. Yeah, very precocious young person then. So your differences with your father then were less about whether markets ought to be free, but the other roles and rights that government may or should not have.
The difference eventually, initially I agreed with his position, but I wasn't very happy with it because it seemed to me on the one way of putting it is, are you obliged to obey laws? And on the one hand, I thought that if people did not feel obliged to obey laws, you couldn't have enough police to enforce everything and the society would break down. On the other hand, it did not seem to me that right and wrong were made by act of Congress. So I didn't see why the government making something a law had a moral effect. And my decision, I think at the point I went to college roughly, was that I would act as if one was obliged to obey laws until I had a satisfactory solution to the problem, because it might be true. And that failing to do things you have a right to do is not an immoral act, whereas doing things you don't have a right to do is an immoral act. And I eventually noticed that other people did not act as if they believed they were obliged to obey laws, that people routinely offered, a glass of wine or of beer to a friend who was a year below the legal age. People routinely drive a bit over the speed limit and so forth. And so I concluded that I had been wrong, that what you need for a society to work is some combination of enough law enforcement to prevent some crimes and enough general agreement about what things people ought to do so that people don't go around doing things that would require a huge number of police to stop them. And at that point, I concluded, therefore, that I was at that point an anarchist in terms of moral philosophy. That is, I didn't think the government had rights. That didn't answer the question of whether or not you needed a government, though. It might be that even though you're not obliged to obey it, if there isn't a government collecting taxes and paying for police and so forth, the society will collapse, which many people believe. And I think my father's view is that that was probably the case. And my eventual view was that it was probably not the case, but it could be. I have never claimed that I can prove that a market anarchy would work under all circumstances. I only claim to have plausible arguments for why under many circumstances it would work and be attractive.
You've said many things that I'd like to get to in more detail. One of the things you said is that right and wrong were not made by acts of Congress. And I would really like to better understand, I guess, your meta-ethical position, so where right and wrong do come from then, since that is going to be very important. But I would like to start by just getting some terminology on the table first, since for many of our listeners, they will have never heard the term anarcho-capitalism before. And since you're a self-styled anarchist economist, I think we should start with anarchist. And most people associate the word anarchy with chaos, or today maybe with Antifa, but that's pretty far from where you fall on the landscape. So maybe we should just start with how you think of this anarchist landscape and where the anarchist in your title places you.
What I mean by an anarchist is somebody who is in favor of a society which has no government. And then the question that raises is, how do you define a government? That if you think about it, I don't believe there is any activity governments engage in that has not at some time and place been engaged in by by things we don't think of as governments. So my standard example is making war. That the Norse armies that ravaged Anglo-Saxon England, as best I can tell, were entrepreneurial projects. That is to say, some leader with a good reputation said, hey, let's get a whole bunch of people and go raid England, and we can get gold and get them to pay us off to go away, and maybe we'll grab some land and so forth. So that's what we think of as a government activity, but it was being done privately. And I think, as far as I can tell, maybe I'm missing something, but I think that's true of all government activities. So to me, at least, the defining feature is what in my first book I defined as an agency of legitimized coercion. And I went into that in much more detail in a much later article and then a chapter in my third edition of that book, where the idea is that in a functioning society, well, let me go back a step. Let me go back before humans. Territorial behavior in animals is a pattern you observe in a fair number of different species, mostly birds and fishes, but some mammals too. And territorial behavior consists of an animal somehow marking the territory he is claiming, and then, as it were, turning a switch in his brain so that if another member of his species and gender trespasses on that territory, he will fight, and will fight more desperately the farther in the trespasser comes. Most of the time, a fight to the death is a loss for both parties, unless there's a very large inequality of force. Therefore, once the trespasser recognizes the commitment, it pays him to back off. For economists, this is sort of an animal version of the problem of bilateral monopoly, where in bilateral monopoly, where I have an apple and you want an apple, and you're the only person in the world who values apples, and I don't care about apples. That's worth nothing to me. It's worth $10 to you. If I could somehow commit myself not to accept any price other than $9.50, you'd pay it. But if you could commit yourself not to pay more than 50 cents, I'd accept it. Well, this is an animal version of that. And then my view is that the way a functioning society works is that human beings have the equivalent of the territorial behavior of commitment, but it's not necessarily in geography. That we have a set of mental lines of what are the things that if somebody does them to me, I will be willing to bear what seem like unreasonably large costs to stop him. So my sort of standard example for that is somebody grabs a kid's toy that your kid is playing with and runs off down the street. And you run after him yelling, "Stop thief." The toy cost you $3. The chance of tripping and hurting yourself by more than $3 is high. The chance if you fight him of getting more than $3 is damage is high. So you're willing to, in effect, bear a cost much more than $3 to enforce your view that that toy belongs to you and the kid. On the other hand, when the government tells you, by the way, you're going to be on a jury next week, which is exactly the same sort of thing. It's like somebody enslaving you. You don't react that way. You say, well, if I can avoid the jury at a reasonable cost, I'll avoid the jury. But if it requires really large efforts to me, I'll put up with it. So I think of the government as an agency against which people drop the commitment strategies that normally enforce their view of their rights, of what they're entitled to do. And the claim, from my standpoint, the claim of anarchy is you do not have to have an institution of that sort in order for society to work. Now, in terms of different kinds of anarchists, the obvious difference is going to be in what they imagine, how they imagine the society works, what substitutes you have for the things that governments in the societies we're used to do. And a anarcho-capitalist is somebody who imagines a society where the basic coordination mechanism is voluntary exchange, is market kind of transactions. And that includes, from my standpoint, if three people get together and decide to do something together because they're all in favor of it, that's still a voluntary transaction, even though there's no payment. So it's not a market in the normal sense. And indeed, from my standpoint, a workers' co-op is consistent with anarcho-capitalism as long as it's voluntarily formed, does not seize stuff from other people and so forth. That it's just a particular form of corporation, as it were. But there are other anarchists. There are anarcho-communists who, as best I can tell, imagine a society with no property rights, or maybe at least no property rights in means of production, maybe no property rights at all. There are syndicalists who think they're anarchists, although it's not clear to me that what they're imagining is syndicates that control things aren't really governments. But I'd have to understand their views better than I do to be sure of that. But I think in modern day America, that quite a lot of the small number of people who call themselves anarchists, I think quite a lot of them are anarcho-capitalists, that it's a fairly well-recognized libertarian faction and has been for decades. Although there are certainly other people who call themselves anarchists who are nothing at all like that.
I think the place to dig in before we move on is to the definition of government as an agency of legitimized coercion. And I was trying to think of a counterexample. So,
but first, let me make it clear that legitimized does not mean legitimate.
Right.
And coercion is not a statement about my moral system. Coercion means those things that would be treated as coercion by the people who the government's doing them to. And legitimized means they don't react in the way you normally react to somebody coercing you. Now continue.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'll get back to that in 1 second. So I was thinking about a counterexample. So a government that isn't this, or something that's non-governmental that also has this quality that it's the agency of legitimized coercion, but nothing immediately came to mind. So I just wanted to ask further, what is coercion? Is that a monopoly of force?
No, coercion I tried to make it clear in the first edition of Machinery that I was using both legitimized and coercion as specialized meanings. And I understood that better by the third edition, but I think I basically intuited it at the beginning, that coercion is doing things which would be treated as rights violations to be resisted if they were done by somebody other than the government. And I could imagine, look, let's take this recent case in Spain where somebody who was in charge of running women's hockey or something, some women's sport, kissed the star woman player, and people objected. One can easily enough imagine one society in which the normal reaction of the woman to that would be, oh, great, he likes me, we're all happy because we just won this game, and so forth. And a different society in which her reaction would be to slap him or to scream or to do. So where people draw the lines are going to vary. Look, the very simplest thing you can see that in is how close people stand to each other. That's something that varies with cultures. And at some point, if somebody literally gets in your face, in the literal sense of that, his nose is an inch from your nose, you're going to start feeling as though he's pushing you around, and you should be willing to bear costs to stop him. Some other society, you might not. So I have moral categories. That is, some of the things, there might well be things that would be coercion in that sense that I don't really think are coercive, and vice versa. But my basic point is only that for the purpose of defining government, what matters is what are the things people are committed to resist, as it were, not what are the things that are morally wrong.
Mm-hmm. So Apple can't tax me or imprison me or in other ways infringe on my rights. And it is for that reason that it's not this agency of coercion. And then can we further spell out what makes...
But if Apple raises the price of a Macintosh, you don't feel obliged to do very strong things to get them. You could imagine somebody who believed in the idea of a just price and who said, look, you've been selling this nice Macintosh for $1,000. This year you've raised it to $1,100. That's wicked. You're not allowed to do it. Even though it's worth $1,100 to me, I won't buy it. That's not an impossible view. Some people do have sort of emotional responses of that sort, though I think they're hard to justify. So in that case, raising the price would be, from his standpoint, coercion. And then he would say, all right, if people let government do it, but it's not legitimized because he is resisting by not buying the computer. But if you said, all right, nonetheless, you have to buy it. At that point, Apple would be a government, because, and even if you think about things like eminent domain, where the government forces a sale at what it thinks is the legitimate price. Well, you could imagine doing the same thing with a purchase. Suppose Apple says, look, it's true we've raised the price of this computer by $100, but look, here are the reasons as to we're justified in doing that. Therefore, you're refusing to buy it is unjustified, therefore you have to buy it. Right? Some somewhat odd legal rule, but you could certainly imagine that. And in a sense, there's a sense in which you have that in employment non-discrimination laws. That is to say, those laws in effect say, if the reason you didn't hire this person was a bad reason because you're prejudiced against his race, you have to hire him, or we'll penalize you for not doing it. So that's a case where you do have, as it were, the equivalent of a forced sale. Anyway, but enough. I think I made the point.
I did want to move on to, now that we've clarified coercion, I wanted to just clarify your technical meaning of legitimized. So the fact that government is an agency of coercion and it's legitimized means that it's socially or tacitly or systemically accepted, or how do you...
accepted in terms of behavior, not necessarily of beliefs. That even an anarchist who may say the government collecting taxes from me or the government putting me on a jury is wrong, it's a violation of my rights, but he nonetheless does not in fact resist it. At least most of them don't. And therefore, he is not treating it he's therefore, it is legitimized to him in the sense that it doesn't trigger the kind of reactions that rights violations normally trigger.
And there could be many different reasons by that. So for that, so one could be, it could be legitimized by the threat of force. That might be one reason.
That's right. But on the other hand, I wouldn't consider something if a mugger points a gun at me and I don't fight him. It's not that it's legitimized. I'd be perfectly willing to fight him if I thought I had a good chance of winning. It's just that the claim, what defines it as coercion is that I'm willing to take on reasonably high costs, not infinite costs, in order to act against it. So if the only reason that I go along with government, if when the government taxes me, I do nothing to stop it, and the reason I do nothing to stop it is anything I could stop it will get me locked up in jail, that's not legitimized coercion. That's just successful extortion. But if, as I think is the case, somebody would say, well, look, there are things I could do to fight it. I could lie on my taxes. I could leave the country. I could do various things. If it was easy enough, I would do them. But if they impose any serious cost to me, I won't do them. In that case, he's treating it as a government, as legitimized.
So we're going to get to the specifics and some of the applications, possible criticisms, all of these things. But I think that this is very good to lay out at the beginning what this terminology means. So the anarchic portion of your philosophy is that there is, or no body should be this agency of legitimized coercion. And that handles the anarcho portion of your title. And the second part is capitalist. So how does that fit in?
That means that the way the society coordinates is private property and voluntary exchange, as opposed to a society where anybody can take anything they want from anybody else, and the reason you believe it coordinates is because people will be good and kind and do things for each other and so forth. That would be a very different kind of society. But they feel entitled to use force if you don't. I think from my standpoint, that's why you would call it, some people sometimes call it market anarchy, or, there are a variety of other terms for people who don't like the term capitalist. I think the term capitalist may have been invented by socialists. I'm not sure, but it's often used by people who don't like it.
That is true. It definitely has pejorative connotations. And this is just a minor point before we move on, but is this all just another way of saying that you're a libertarian? Or where is the line that distinguishes these positions? Maybe libertarians simply still want a minimal government.
That depends on the libertarian. I would say that libertarian is not a very sharply defined category. And I would say that a libertarian is somebody who would like a society with a lot of individual liberty. And that includes people who would say, well, it would be nice if we could do it without government entirely, but we can't. If we don't have a government, we'll have rights violations by private people. And therefore, I'm in favor of a minimum government. That's probably a majority of libertarians hold that position and have for a long time. But it also includes people who take it a little bit further and say we can do with no government at all. But of course, even in an anarcho-capitalist society, you don't have zero coercion. There will be, some successful thieves and muggers and so forth. In almost any society, you're not going to get zero rights violation. But again, as I was suggesting before, I think that in defining anarchist, there's a useful distinction between a moral position and an economic position. That is, one could hold that morally the government has no right, but in fact we're better off if we have a government, or at least a minimal government, because after all, the muggers have no rights either, and hopefully a government will keep the muggers from mugging me. And there's no rights to be muggers. They have lots of other rights, obviously. So I would say that I'm an anarchist both in the sense that my moral intuitions say that the fact that Congress votes something doesn't affect morality. And that as an economist, my guess is that I think there's a good chance that you can have an attractive society with no government. But you can easily enough imagine somebody who believed one of those and didn't believe the others. You can imagine someone who had no moral objection to government at all, just thought it was a mistake. As one could imagine somebody who was morally opposed to government but thinks we can't do without it.
So obviously, there are a number of moving parts. You've mentioned at least just two that motivate your adoption of anarcho-capitalism, but I'd like to try narrowing them down. So as you just indicated, there's obviously an ethical dimension in which you don't think anyone or thing has the right to dictate another person's behavior or infringe upon their rights. And then that's one. Then I think there's also a theoretical dimension, and you haven't said this yet, but a free market is simpler than an engineered market. And I'm wondering if it's safe to also say that there's a practical component in that you suspect a totally free market would do better, whatever that means, than alternatives.
One of the arguments that I've been making for a long time is if you consider the tension between the anarchist and the limited government libertarian, that one of the problems the limited government libertarian has is that he agrees that governments are very bad at producing things. That if the government makes the cars, they're likely to be expensive and not work very well. And if the government runs the whole food system, you may have famines. But he relies on the government to produce law and law enforcement. And as anybody who has been to law school or has had much experience with knows, laws are not simple. That is, it's easy to stand at a distance and say, here's, the three rules that run the world. But then when you actually get into applying them, determining, what evidence, what level of evidence does it take to convict somebody of a crime or of a tort? What should the punishment be? It's a very, very complicated system. and yet they are relying on this government that's incompetent to do to do difficult things, to do this very difficult thing in a very important area. So from that standpoint, it seems to me it should be clear to almost any limited government libertarian that if you could do away with government, if you could have a system in which law and law enforcement were produced on the market, that would be an improvement. And the question is, can you have it? Would such a system work? And then I argue that in the kind of anarchist system I've sketched in my first book, law is itself being produced on the market, that you have, as it were, a competitive market for laws. It's different in a number of important ways from ordinary markets, but that nonetheless you have the same general tendency to produce a well-designed product, as it were, that you do in other markets. And that would be from my standpoint, the practical argument in favor of anarcho-capitalism over limited government libertarianism. Then if you're arguing with people who aren't limited government libertarians, you could then use all of the standard pro-market arguments on why government-run things work badly.
Law and law enforcement is a special case that deserves more attention, but it's definitely a common point that I think often goes unsubstantiated, that government is bad at making things, so to speak. And I was wondering if there are any particularly poignant examples of this that come to mind to make it more concrete.
Well, I mean, Ukraine famine, the famine at the time of the Great Leap Forward, U.S. Post Office doesn't do all that well. U.S. Post Office survived only because it made it illegal to compete with it back in the 19th century.
Maybe we should stick with the U.S. Post Office. So I don't follow the USPS very well. I know that a lot of my mail gets lost, so maybe that is.
Well, it loses money. It required a subsidy. As far as I know, UPS and FedEx don't require any subsidy. It has a monopoly of first-class mail. It's legal for the UPS and FedEx and anybody else to deliver packages, but not letters. And even with that monopoly, it's apparently going broke. But it's not like I'm an expert on the post office. But I think you can observe in lots of if you look at the economy of the Soviet Union or of China back when it was still a socialist society, which maybe it's sliding back to now, I'm not sure. That they seem to do very badly. That there's this fascinating book by Ronald Coase, his final book on how China went capitalist, and it's clear that one part of what happens when Mao dies is that the other important people can finally go abroad and look at the rest of the world, and here they have what they believe is the world's best economic system, and they're dirt poor compared to everybody else. And that is a puzzle which ultimately gets resolved by abandoning the economic system, although they don't say they're doing that. So in that sense, it seems to me there's quite a lot of evidence that governments don't do very well. Public schools are very expensive, and they seem generally to, private schools, most of which spend much less per student, nonetheless manage to attract students. So even though the private school is spending less, and what it spends is coming from the parents, which is an advantage of the public school, which has got its tax money, and nonetheless the private schools can compete. So it seems to me that it's a pretty common observation that most government-run things don't work very well. And I'm sure there are exceptions. If you have an organization that's run by a smart enthusiast, that one of the problems I think you have in practice is that some smart enthusiast figures out a way of doing something, of solving a problem, of getting kids who are on welfare educated or something. And he does it, and it works. And then the government says, great, this is a great idea. Let's hire 1,000 people to do 1,000 of these. And none of those 1,000 people are enthusiasts, and none of them are especially smart at doing this, and it flops. And when the same thing happens on the market, the smart enthusiast starts a company, and maybe other people imitate him, but they have to imitate him with their own money. And if they're not as good, they go out of business. Anyway,
I didn't know that private schools pay less per student, but now that I think about
What's
it,
going on is that people think of private schools as prep schools. The prep schools are very expensive, but they are a tiny fraction of the top private school market. So if you look at average private school, it depends on the state, but I think the public schools are probably typically spending something like $11,000 to $15,000 per student per year, if you include everything. Maybe more if you include the value of the land they're sitting on, and the buildings they have, which have been given to them and which they don't have to pay rent on, unlike a private school. But the ordinary private schools, I've seen the numbers. I don't remember them, but I think probably the expenditure is about half as much on average.
Yeah, I was going to say, I suppose though that I have heard that this is part of the argument for a charter school system. And
depends on to what degree the charter school has to compete for students and to what degree it's getting subsidized. The standard charter schools are also getting tax money. I think there's an argument for there are various ways in which you can get something more like a market within a government institution, so that you could say the simplest way is you say in the public school system that kids can go to any school they like and the money follows the kids. And in that situation, the individual public schools have to compete with each other if they want to get any income. Now it gets better if you now allow private people to also make schools and have the same money to them, and then you have a voucher system. But even without the private schools, you can to some degree set up competitive institutions in government activity, but it's hard to do it very well.
The other thing I was going to say is that it had never occurred to me that the USPS has a monopoly on first-class mail, which now that I think about it also just strikes me as totally artificial and totally bizarre.
It's called the Private Express statutes. And the Private Express, the story, I'm not sure it's right, but I think it is that they were passed in the 19th century when Lysander Spooner started the American Letter Mail Company, was delivering mail, I think, on a much more limited way than a modern post office at a considerably lower price than the post office. And it was all right until they put in a bid to the U.S. government to deliver their mail. And at that point, they passed the Private Express statutes to put him out of business. Now, I don't swear that's right. Lysander Spooner was a 19th century anarchist, so one is especially sympathetic to him. He wrote this wonderful short book called No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, in which he's saying, well, look, when did I sign this contract that I'm supposed to be bound by? But in any case, but it's certainly the case that the Private Express statutes were passed in the 19th century, and they do prevent other people from carrying first class mail. I think the story about Lysander Spooner's role in it is correct, but I don't swear it is. I'm not a 19th century historian.
Well, returning to our main thread and this third criterion beyond ethical and theoretical that I mentioned, so practical, your faith that, practically speaking, an anarcho-capitalist society would fare better than alternatives. I think this raises a broader question that we should talk about, which is just what would be the empirical mark of success that we would use to judge alternatives if we were going to pit, hypothetically, communism versus anarcho-capitalism and so on?
Communism is making it too easy. So we've done that experiment. If you pick communism against capitalism, you have a very simple measure, and that is that the guards on the Berlin Wall are facing East Germany, not West Germany. That is to say, the simple measure is where people want to move. So if you imagine not competing with communism, which is easy, but competing with an ordinary mixed economy, if you imagine the U.S. going anarcho-capitalist and Canada not, if after a while you observe that there were few Americans who wanted to migrate to Canada and lots of Canadians who wanted to migrate to America, that would be pretty good evidence that it was working.
Okay, so it's maybe general human flourishing, but I wonder if we could pick out the actual metrics or parameters that might result in people wanting to move somewhere, just to make it more specific, something that can be tested I guess you could obviously test this with a survey.
But you could see where you could watch the flows of people.
Mm-hmm.
If the Canadians aren't letting people in, and the Americans are letting people in, and the Canadians have people who want to come, and have few people who want to come. Sorry, if the Canadians are not letting people out, and the Americans are, as in the East Germany, West Germany case, that would tell you pretty well. So it seems to me that where people want to go is a better summary than a single measure like income, which is a little tricky because how do you compare the money being used in the different places? And life expectancy, that might be of some value if you actually had the data, but it'll take you a while before you know. But I haven't done the experiment. That is to say, I know of stateless societies in the past, and they weren't obviously less successful than the societies with governments that were coexisted with them, but not like we have good statistics for the 10th century Iceland or Comanche in the 19th century, to take two examples of state. Well, Iceland is semi-stateless, but anyway, was.
I suppose my hang up is just that the idea of using desirability of living as your measure is that it doesn't seem to tell us what in particular we're expecting from the success of a given economic political philosophy.
What we're expecting from the success of it is that it will be a society people want to live in.
Yeah. And I guess then maybe
you could imagine that the more successful society has lower income because people really like leisure. And lots of them are sort of ascetics who don't have very many material tastes, but boy, do they enjoy it. That could still be a more successful society. A little harder to imagine the more successful society having a shorter life expectancy, but it's not impossible if you imagine that the less successful society is one which feels very strongly about keeping people alive in the hospital for the last possible moment, even if they're miserable. And spending lots of the societal resources on that, it might have a higher life expectancy. And of course, if one of the societies has more women than men, that'll give it a longer life expectancy because women live a couple of years longer than men do.
Well, maybe then the point is that what constitutes a successful society is an issue for psychology that you're not interested in getting into, rather than one that can be broken down into economic issues.
I'm an economist. I believe in revealed preference. How people act, which society they want to be in, is the appropriate objective test.
Okay. No, I think that's a fair philosophical point that I just hadn't considered. So it's kind of difficult to wrap my mind around. But no, interesting.
But you were asking earlier where my moral beliefs came from, and I don't know if it's worth going into that or not.
Oh, sure. Would you like to now? I think I saw it was at the end of the book. Or
I'm an intuitionist.
Yeah, Isaiah Berlin.
And you can, well, the person, it's an argument I lost with Isaiah Berlin, but I don't know enough about what his views are to know how nearly what I ended up with was his, only that's what I ended up with after losing an argument with him. But Michael Huemer is a professional philosopher and a libertarian who actually has a book on intuitionism, so if people are curious. But it's basically the idea that just as I can see things in the outside world, I can so perceive moral truths, as can everybody. That there is a set of moral facts out there, but they're not a non-physical thing, just as the mathematics is a non-physical thing. That human beings have some imperfect ability to perceive those moral truths, that they build moral theories on top of their perceptions, just as we build physical theories on top of our perceptions. That just as in the case of physical theories, even if we're all seeing the same thing, we may come to very different conclusions about the overall pattern. And that's the basic position. I'm not sure it's right, but I haven't found any more satisfactory basis for moral beliefs.
Are you religious at all? And yeah, and your background is in physics. Are you a physicalist or a materialist? I mean, it doesn't sound that way. What I mean by that is you think all things are physical or material, but evidently if
I
you
don't
think
know.
that they're...
I don't know. That is, first, I don't know what counts as a thing. Are all true statements about physical things? Well, I'm not at all sure that all of the theorems of mathematics are statements about physical things. Uh, the I I haven't spent a lot of time on philosophy, and when I read philosophers, I only occasionally am impressed by them. Uh, I generally, my view is that the fact that Rawls is taken seriously is a reason not to take modern political philosophy seriously, because his most famous accomplishment is complete nonsense. He basically took an argument that Harsanyi made, and Harsanyi drew the correct logical conclusion from it. And Rawls said, I don't like that conclusion, so I'll wave my hands and change it and get a conclusion I like. And that strikes me as the sort of thing that one shouldn't take seriously in intellectual activities. On the other hand, I occasionally read a philosopher who seems to me to have neat and interesting ideas and have thought about things. But it's not as if I spend a lot of time thinking about philosophy.
Well, could we go in, if you don't mind, what is the Rawls hasn't come up that much on the show, and I'm wondering what the Rawlsian argument is that you find so meaningless.
Yes. The basic idea, which Harsanyi had like 20 years or something before Rawls, is to imagine that you are in an initial situation where you do not know what role in society you will hold. So you think of yourself as, we're going to choose a society with some set of social rules, and I will then be randomly put into it. And the question is, how would you decide what the rules are that you want in that situation? And Harsanyi's answer was, fortunately, this guy called Johnny von Neumann has solved this problem, that von Neumann showed that you can define utility functions in such a way that the utility of a lottery is the expected value of the outcomes, of the utility of the outcomes. So that, well, he says, you're imagining a lottery. This is a situation where you have, one chance in 100 million of being any of the 100 million people in the society. So therefore, whatever society maximizes average utility is the one you would choose. Now, he isn't necessarily correct. I don't know that the initial setup is correct, but he's correctly drawing the conclusion from that initial setup. Rawls didn't like that. So Rawls said, oh no, you don't know what the probabilities are. And he said, if you don't know what the probabilities are, you will be an ultimate pessimist. You will assume that however the society is set up, I will be the worst off person in it. And therefore, the rule you will follow is those set of social rules that maximize the welfare of the worst off person. That was what he got famous for, and it's complete nonsense. He never offered any reason why anybody would act that way. You have decisions much short of that people engage in, and people do not act as if they're infinitely risk averse. They don't act as if they assume that if they're facing a gamble, they will always lose, always get the worst outcome. Anyway, it's a diversion, but I'm irritated by bad intellectual work, and it seems to me now Rawls may have done other good things. It's not like I'm an expert on Rawls, but I read the original book that made him famous, and I reached that conclusion, and I've seen no reason to change it since.
Well, then,
and I've had some exchanges with some libertarian political philosophers, part of what call themselves the bleeding heart libertarians. And they aren't willing to agree with Rawls, but they speak positively of him. And I have not been able to get any of them to, in fact, defend what is his most famous conclusion. And anyway, I had a fairly extended online exchange with a couple of them a few years ago.
Well, then, returning to something you said earlier at the beginning of our conversation, you said that government by an act of Congress doesn't make right and wrong. So you've thrown that out. Your philosophy is that there are just facts about what is right and wrong, and we have some way of grasping them, but you don't want to take a stance on how that is.
That's right. We imperfectly perceive them, and we try to build moral systems out of what we perceive, but the perception is much, just as you don't perceive Newton's laws of physics. You perceive objects moving around. Well, you don't perceive the rules of morality. What you perceive is that person acted badly. That was wrong. And I think at that level, most people most of the time agree, though not perfectly, which is in a sense the natural test of whether or not there's an objective reality out there. Doesn't prove there is. There is the alternative explanation that we've all been brainwashed into the same beliefs by our society, or that we've all been brainwashed by our genes, that the moral beliefs we have exist because those were the beliefs that resulted in behavior that led to reproductive success. Those are competing explanations. But none of those explanations answer my question, which is, what should I do? Whereas my explanation does give an answer to that. And given that, I prefer mine among the alternatives.
So if you see a cat being kicked, you're just viscerally confronted with the wrongness of this act. That's basically it. I think, though, that you could also take, as opposed to saying that there are objective moral facts, you could go with a more pragmatic position and say that maybe because of our genes, we are programmed, if you want to use that word, to see wrongness when a cat is being kicked. But you could also acknowledge that if Martians landed, they wouldn't see that wrongness. But that doesn't really matter for you, because what's going to tell you what to do is how you are programmed.
But, then the question is, should I obey my programming? After all, human beings act massively in violation of what their genes want them to do. That the use of birth control, spending your time and effort on pets instead of babies, those are all things in which we are not acting to maximize our reproductive success, due to the fact that the genes did not do a perfect job of controlling us. There's this wonderful metaphor by the author of The Selfish Gene,
Richard Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins. He says that there are science fiction stories where humans make robots and the robots rebel and take over the humans. It's happened. We're the robots. The genes designed us for their purpose of reproductive success. However, part of what turned out to work very well for reproductive success was intelligence. But intelligence from the standpoint of the genes has this downside, that it lets the organism recognize the conflict of interest between what he wants to do and what his genes want him to do, and then choose not to act as the genes want. So it's not like you have to obey your genes. And if it's really the case that the only reason I think stealing is wrong is because my genes or my society programmed into it, then if only I could figure out a way of defeating that program, a way of persuading myself that stealing was right, I'd be better off. Of course, I have to be careful and only steal when I wouldn't get caught. But so I don't think either of the genetic or the social explanations answers the question, what should I do? It only answers the question, why do I mistakenly think I should do things? Whereas the intuitionist one, what we're perceiving is what you should do. What we're perceiving are moral facts. So now you can say it's a biased process to pick the explanation that gives the answer I want, but given several possible explanations, the fact that one of them answers my question and the others don't seems to me a reason for preferring it.
Yeah, no, I can see why positing the existence of moral facts can be more comforting, not to use that word negatively, when asking the question of what you should do. But for me, at least, it's sufficiently troubling that I have no understanding of what could make a moral fact true.
Going back to the question of whether one believes everything is physical reality, is consciousness physical reality?
I would say that everything, from my perspective, everything is physical. Now, whether I can explain it, the answer to that is totally no, but I guess it's an act of faith at this point.
Yeah, that is, it seems to me that one of the biggest holes in my picture of reality is that the most fundamental fact I know is that I am conscious. That's cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And yet I don't understand it. And, it's a little bit comforting because since I'm an atheist, I don't believe in life after death on religious grounds. But after all, if the consciousness is something we don't understand, there's at least a possibility that it survives the physical death, though I don't think it's the way to gamble. But anyway, but that in a sense is some argument against physical being a full account, that I don't think we have any way of understanding how there's somebody looking out through my eyes, as it were. I can explain you, right? You could just be a robot, but I know directly that I'm conscious.
Mm-hmm. I mean, physics has been tremendously successful, and there seems like a road to understanding consciousness. I mean, the program of identifying, systematizing, exploring neural correlates of consciousness, but I don't see an analogous way of figuring out by looking at a cat being kicked what makes it wrong. I can figure out what's making the pain circuits fire in the cat, but wrongness just seems like a predicate that doesn't apply to physical things.
I can believe in intuitionism without understanding what is in the physical, what is the basis for morality. Similarly, for most of the history of mankind, arguably still, people believed in facts of physical reality. They believed that this cup was here and this nose is here and so forth, without an explanation of why. Right? And why did they believe it? Because they observed it. They have senses. The senses mostly give consistent results. We therefore, our best guess is that the reality we perceive is reasonably close to the actual reality, maybe not perfectly close, and so forth. So I don't think that the fact that one doesn't have an equivalent of physics theory to explain morality is an adequate reason not to believe in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it's just a matter of disagreement. I would like to get back to the anarchism. And I'm wondering, we haven't talked about too many of the specifics yet, but I'm wondering if there are, and I think the answer is yes, but if there are no functions whatsoever that you think a government should be trusted to perform. I mean, this is a difficult idea to swallow, as it's...
The way I would put it is that there are some things that a government could do better than the alternatives, but that I know of no way of setting up a government which will do only those things and do them in the way it ought to do and not do other and worse things as well. So as an economist, there are various categories of market failure, public goods and externalities and so forth. But if you think for a moment about the political system as itself a market, if you think about the political system not as a benevolent despot doing good, but as the result of voters and politicians and lobbyists and all the rest of it, you rapidly realize that market failure, which is a relatively rare pattern in the private market, is the norm in the public market. That is to say, if you think about externalities or public goods, which are in a sense the same issue, if I play music in my house, there might be a very faint externality because somebody outside likes the music. And in principle, I may not play music quite as much as I should or as much music as I should because I'm not taking account of his benefit as well as my benefit in the music. But it's a pretty small effect. Most of the effect of playing music in my house is to me. On the other hand, if I lobby a government to pass a tariff, 99.999999% of the cost of that tariff is borne by people other than me. Probably 90%, if you think of me as the president of GM or something, probably 90% of the benefit of the tariff goes to people other than me. That is to say, other auto companies which are benefited by the tariff, auto workers, and so forth. So there's no good reason to think that the fact that it's in my interest to do it means it's in our interest to do it. Whereas in the market, sort of standard economic theory tells you most of the time what's in my interest is in our interest in that sense. So if the mechanism for controlling government is shot through with the kind of problems that occasionally make the mechanism for controlling private markets not work, it's pretty risky to give government powers to do things.
Can we start off on the charitable side of where you began? So what do you think that government might actually do better? Even though you said you couldn't trust a government to do only these things, what might it do better?
That's interesting. In principle, Uh, Dealing with air pollution could be an example. Subsidizing fundamental research could be an example. I'm somewhat skeptical about the latter. One of the several reasons I left physics was that it appeared to me that it was being enormously overinvested in. That is to say that because at the time when I was a graduate student in physics, everybody knew that physics was the important thing for the government to subsidize. After all, we just developed the atomic bomb, hadn't we? And the result, I think, was that you had like 10 times as many very smart people going into physics as physics actually used, which meant that 9 of the 10 people were people who weren't going other places that would be more useful. So that's a case where the government's subsidizing basic research, but it may well do more damage than good. But it could do good because the basic research is hard to propertize. There is actually an English academic who at least claims to have done research on the effect of government subsidy, concluding that it does not do any good, in the sense that his claim is that there are this is a talk I heard a long time ago, but name is Margolis. And I think it's right. Pretty sure it is. Anyway, his claim is that there are a number of cases where some area of science suddenly got a whole lot of government subsidy, and that if you look at them, you do not get a higher rate of progress when that happens. And whether he's right, I don't know. It's something I heard in a talk and might be true. But again, air pollution, I don't think there's really an adequate private market for doing it. If we only had one country in the world and global climate change was really a problem, then a government could deal with it. The problem there, aside from the question of whether it's really a problem, is that in a world of many governments, dealing with climate change is still a public good, even at the level of governments, because each government that does it is providing benefits mostly for other governments. But I think those are the examples of things where you could imagine. And I suppose national defense, defending against other governments, is something where it's plausible that a government could do it better. But again, the problem is that in practice, governments that are given the power to do that then go out and start wars. Anyway, but those would be things. But the problem in general is that we don't have either a way of constraining governments to only do the handful of things they would be better at, or if they do them, to actually get them to do them better. Because let me take a particularly extreme example, and that is that one of the things that the U.S. government does in order to deal with climate change is a massive policy which has 2 effects. It has no effect at all on climate change, it turns out, although it was claimed to when it was instituted. And it makes much more expensive the chief food of 200 million people, most of them poor. That's the biofuels program. The U.S. is the world's largest producer of maize, what Americans call corn. The U.S. converts something like 13 or 14% of the world's supply of maize into alcohol. And maize is the chief foodstuff for about 200 million people, mostly in poor countries. Well, that's a massive contribution to world hunger. And it doesn't even reduce CO2, it turns out. So that's a case where there is a theoretical argument for the government subsidizing things in order to keep down CO2. It's not as good an argument as people think, because we don't really know what the net effects of climate change are going to be, but people think they do. And if it was clear that they were negative and large, there would then be a plausible argument for government doing that. But it ends up doing something that doesn't achieve that objective, does a whole lot of damage in the world. Why does it do it? Because it pushes up the cost of, up the price of maize, and that gets you votes from farmers. As Al Gore, to his credit, has admitted.
I think that this example of air pollution and climate change is quite interesting, especially because it's existentially large and looming. But
it isn't. That's a popular lie. If you actually read the IPCC reports, or if you read Nordhaus, both of which I think are too pessimistic, Nordhaus's estimate is that if we do nothing at all about climate change, by the end of the century, the world will be a few percent poorer. That's not an existential threat. The existential stuff is because it makes good news stories. The real argument is that it will make us somewhat worse off. But that's a long digression. And I should say, I don't agree with that real argument. I don't think we know whether it makes us better or worse off. I think that as far as I can tell, climate change has both positive and negative effects. Both of them are quite uncertain. We're talking about effects spread over a long period of time, and the future is very uncertain. And therefore, I don't think we know whether the negative effects are bigger than the positive ones, although lots of people believe they do. But even if we did, my point is, if you look at the respectable sources of information, such as the IPCC or Nordhaus, the scale of the costs is much less than the rhetoric implies.
Mm-hmm. It is a sufficiently complicated issue, and one that I sufficiently know, or I know sufficiently little about, that I try not to make pronouncements about global warming. But something that does seem safe to say to me is that the risks are sufficiently non-negligible that it's something that has to be taken very seriously. I think that's a safe thing to say. And what I was going to say, the reason that I brought that up is I recently spoke with Deirdre McCloskey, that you know, and we talked about classical liberalism, and climate change came up in the context of something that the free market might not be well suited to handle. And Deirdre's response was that she thinks it is best to be left to the free market. She thinks that on the one hand, as we were talking about it, we placed classical liberalism on a spectrum, and we were talking about the market engineers maybe on the left, so socialists, something like that, and then conservatives on the right. Conservatives don't want to make any changes. The socialists want to make a lot of changes, but her thoughts were that and maybe I'm wrong, but I think this is what I'm recalling. The conservatives just are sticking their head in the sand. The liberals, not her sort of liberals, think they know much more than they do, and she doesn't trust them. But her position is that the classical liberal is optimistic about the future and trusts that rather than let government intervene, the best bet is to believe that engineers will solve the problem in the future if it becomes
There are two different kinds of solutions. The one for which that's right is adaptation. That is to say, changing your crop variety in order to adjust to the fact that the temperature is a degree higher than it used to be is a private good for the individual farmer. It is in the interest of people who produce seeds to try to breed varieties that will be optimized against the changed environment. So there you can expect engineering to do it. But for keeping the climate change from happening, it's not clear that it's in the private interest of anybody to do that. Now, it might turn out, if the government gives lots of money to people who do that some clever person will find out a good way of doing it, but I don't trust the government to decide who to give money to. As I say, the government currently has a massive policy that is almost certainly killing several million people a year. That's the biofuels. I don't have numbers on it, obviously. But if you've got 200 million people and you're making their chief food stuff twice as expensive as it used to be, and they're poor people, it seems to me that's got to raise mortality rates noticeably. So it's not as if, government action always does good things.
So your position, and I'm inferring here, is that because we can't trust government to do only the things that it can do well, the best bet, or what you would like to see if you were, you don't want to be king, but if you could snap your fingers and make these things happen, is that we wouldn't prevent global warming because you don't want a government to be interfering, and you would end up relying on this second situation in which adaptation, as you put it, where engineers solve the problem in the future.
That's right. Global warming might or might not happen very much, depending on sort of the accidents of technology. If it turns out that nuclear or thermonuclear or solar and wind plus battery become cheaper than fossil fuel. We will then produce much less CO2, and global warming will slow down and maybe eventually stop. CO2 doesn't have an infinite lifetime after all. So in the atmosphere doesn't. CO2 itself does. And that is to say, it isn't radioactive. It doesn't decay. It's just that it gets taken out of the atmosphere in various ways. So I'm not necessarily predicting that it will continue, but I am saying that I do not think having the government try to make it stop is a sensible strategy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I should just say I spoke with somebody else a few days ago. His name is Tim Palmer. He's a leading physicist and meteorologist at Oxford. And he was essentially echoing what you were saying, in that we really don't know if climate change is going to happen. What he narrowed it down to is that we don't have enough understanding of clouds, really, and things could go one way or the other. But his position, based on everything he knows, is that it is something that should be taken seriously.
That is, my view is not that we don't know it's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen a century from now, but I think we can be pretty confident that the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere will be higher 5 years from now than it is now, and that probably average temperatures will be a little higher 5 years from now, although there's a lot of random noise in that signal, so they might not be. But if you go 20 or 30 years, it would be surprising if average temperature didn't go up a bit. On the other hand, you're talking about very small changes. That is, the total global warming so far since about 1913, which is roughly when it started, is somewhat over 1 degree centigrade, less than 2 degrees centigrade. So it's a matter of, you have to imagine that very small changes. The way I like to put it is that if you believe the high end of the IPCC estimates for the end of the century, by the end of the century, Minnesota will be as warm as Iowa is now. Well, Iowa manages pretty well. So anyway, but that would be a long discussion. But anyway, but I think that what strikes me is really as most uncertain. I mean, there is some uncertainty about the rate of temperature increase, but I think more uncertainty about the effects on climate in other ways, about the question of whether you get more flooding and such and drought, and most uncertainty about the effect of whatever happens on people. That I don't think we know whether raising temperature by 2 degrees results in more people dying or fewer people dying, because it results in more heat waves, but also fewer cold waves, basically. And currently, many more people die of cold than of heat.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad that we've spoken about just some things that government might do better, because I think it's important to acknowledge, as it would otherwise be difficult to take the thesis seriously if, for instance, you suggested that the free market...
Air pollution is probably a better example. That is, there are lots of problems the government are dealing with climate change. Climate change, I think of as something where, under some imaginable circumstances, it would make sense for government to deal with it, just not the circumstances that exist. On the other hand, air pollution, there are certainly forms of air pollution which pretty clearly do real damage, and ways in which government can deal with them, which are not all that difficult. So I would not be surprised if you could somehow make a government if you could somehow make a very short list of things the government was allowed to do, that it would have good results. It's just I don't know any way of making and enforcing such a list.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, though, for some things that might at least facially seem that they shouldn't function well in an anarchic world, but that you have argued can function. So the first thing that comes to mind is police. How would police function in a world without government? Yeah,
well, the system which I sketched in Machinery is one in which individuals are customers of firms that enforce their rights and settle their disputes. And every pair of such firms who have customers who might run into each other agree in advance on a private court, an arbitrator, whose verdicts they will accept. So you then have a network system in which if somebody robs me, I call my rights enforcement agency and they send a cop to try to catch him. And if They catch him, and he denies having robbed me. And he has a rights enforcement agency of his own, which is not the same as mine, probably. Then the two rights enforcement agencies have agreed in advance that they will accept the verdict of the court the private arbitrator of the court that they've agreed on in advance. And if he loses the case, his rights enforcement agency won't defend him. Mine will force him to pay me compensation or whatever the legal rule is. So it's a system in which the police are private. You do realize that England didn't have any police until about 1820.
I did not.
Yeah, Robert Peel invented the English police force in the early 19th century. And in the 18th century, if you basically, criminal law was privately prosecuted, the enforcement of the verdict was public. So if somebody stole your horse, it was up to you to find out who did it, to then report it to a constable who could arrest him for you, to bring the evidence to the court and have him prosecuted, and he gets convicted, he gets hanged or transported to the New World or something. And there were people in the business of doing this for you. There were so-called thief takers who were in the business of catching thieves. And to some extent, that was motivated by rewards. That varied a lot according to the particular crime and where it happened. And to some extent by rewards from the victim who would pay. And there were various, it was more complicated than this system. But really, you didn't have anything that we would recognize as a police force until Peel invented it. And the only cases where the government was itself, where you had equivalent of a district attorney, where your government was in charge of prosecuting, were crimes that were actually against the government. So if you stole something from the government, they would hire a lawyer to go after you. But if you stole something from me, that was interest to the government only at the point when I had tracked you down, I or somebody working for you. Anyway, that's my most recent book is called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours. And it has one of the very long chapters is on 18th century England, because it's a fascinating system. It's not clear when you start thinking about it how it worked, or why it was set up the way it was set up. It was a legal system where all serious crimes were in theory capital, the only exception being manslaughter. But on the other hand, of the people who were charged with such capital crimes, maybe 1 in 8 got executed. And of the people who convicted, maybe 40%, we don't know, but something like that. So it was a weird and interesting system. It's a fun book. You can get it on Kindle, or you can read a very late draft on my webpage if you'd rather. But anyway, but in any case, what I'm describing is a system where you would have police who were employees of private firms, and the private firms are being paid by their customers to provide police protection to them. No, the hard problem is not police. The hard problem is national defense.
Well, before we get to national defense, though, I can imagine what you've just sketched out as, okay, England pre-1820 is not Malibu, but I can imagine this working in Malibu where people have the funding to hire this private enforcement. But I don't see how this
Who do you think is paying for the police now? Is it coming by money falling out of the sky?
No, but
if you look at government expenditures, the expenditure for court and police is a tiny fraction of the total expenditure of governments. Nonetheless, all of that expenditure is being paid for by people. So if you're presently being taxed $10,000 a year, of which $100 a year is spent on police, surely you can afford $100 a year for private police when you're no longer being taxed.
Right. But so I'm imagining a place like the south side of Chicago where there is very little income, but there's an inordinate amount of crime. And I don't think that it is tax money coming from those districts that is paying for the policing there. Maybe I'm wrong, and you can tell me that.
That is to say, the answer is I do not know what the distribution of tax revenue for his expenditure is, but I would be very surprised if the tax revenue from the south side of Chicago was not larger than the expenditures on police force in the south side of Chicago. because given that the expenditure of the state and federal government is probably 50 times the expenditure, the fraction of it, I don't know the numbers, but it's a large multiple of the numbers of the amount spent on police enforcement. So even if the south side of Chicago only pays for half of its expenses, since its expenses are not mostly police and courts, it's still going to be paying much more than police and courts would cost.
Okay, so your point is that my intuition, due to my lack of knowledge of the financing
you can look up the numbers pretty easily, and I looked them up a long time ago, so I'm out of date. But police and courts are not a major factor. Could look it up right now if you felt like it. Look up the budget of the state of Illinois.
But you think my intuition is wrong, and this is something that could be implemented even in poor communities?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then let's move on.
You will notice at present that it is the poor communities are typically worse off in the things provided by government. All right,
yes,
government has in effect a monopoly of two things: schooling and law enforcement. And the worst schools are in the poor areas, and the highest crime rates are in the poor areas. Anyway.
That's interesting. I imagine, though, that
there are grocery stores on the part of the south side you're thinking of, which is not the part where I lived in. It's a little bit farther south. Well, except when I was a graduate student, actually, I was on the wrong side of the Midway for a year or two. But the grocery stores there are probably a little more expensive than the grocery stores in the good areas, because it's more expensive to run a store when there's a high crime rate, and they probably have somewhat lower quality, but nonetheless, you're getting more or less, it's not a huge difference between what's available on the private market for grocery stores or buying cars or things of that sort between the poor and the rich areas. Rich people buy, nicer food and better cars. But there's a very large difference between, as I say, in law enforcement and in schools. But continue.
Well, actually, before we move on to police forces, a different sort of crime occurs to me right now. It doesn't seem to me like the private market or the free market would be able to protect against insider trading. It seems like if insider trading, for instance, or white collar crime would just become totally rampant, because the people who might be policing that would have no incentive to police it.
No, because the appropriate solution, it's not clear that insider trading is a bad thing, but the appropriate approach is that part of the contract that part of the way a corporation is set up does or does not permit its insiders to trade. And if the rule is that your employees are not allowed to trade on the stock on inside knowledge, then it is in the interest of the company, having made that rule, to enforce it. They can enforce it either by firing people who do it, or if they want to go further, by having a contract with the employee where the employee agrees to forfeit $10,000 if he doesn't do that, and so forth and so on. There's no particular reason. Contract law is enforceable in an anarchist system. So what you won't be able to control probably is insider trading by people who have no connection to the corporation. Because the barber who overheard a conversation among insiders can't. You probably won't be able to get. But no, the insider trading has the advantage of getting information to the market faster, because the insiders are the ones who have it, and when they trade, that affects the market. It has the disadvantage, mainly the disadvantage, that it means that the gains from change do not go to the ordinary stockholder, but go to the particular, at least some of them go to the people who have the inside information. But yeah, no, I also, my guess is you won't be able to enforce laws against drug use and prostitution, but then I don't think those laws should be enforced. So that's a plus, not a minus from my standpoint. Or gambling. That in general, what's basically going on is that the laws are being produced in a market. The people producing the laws, the arbitration agencies, are selling them to the rights enforcement agencies. From the rights enforcement agencies, from their standpoint, part of the product they're selling their customers is what laws they'll be judged under. So that means that a law which benefits one person by $100 and hurts by another person by $200, if they're both customers of the same agency, it will probably not pay the agency to accept that law or the arbitration agency to offer it. And even if they're customers of different agencies, since the two agencies have to agree on what arbitration agency they will accept, you would expect that you would tend to get roughly economically efficient law. That is law which maximizes the value to all the people affected. There are some exceptions, but that would be the normal pattern. And then I think it will be the case that it is very rare that I get more by violating your rights than you lose by my violating your rights. And therefore, it would be very rare to have a case where it's economically efficient to have a rule that lets you violate rights or lets anybody violate rights. On the other hand, the value to a heroin addict of being able to consume heroin is very high. The value to other people, as long as the laws are being enforced with regard to theft and such, of not letting him use heroin is very low, especially since heroin is going to be cheap if it's not illegal, and therefore there will be less reason to steal in order to get it. So I think there's going to be very little market pressure to ban victimless crimes, to ban drug use, gambling, and prostitution would be probably the three big examples of victimless crime in our system.
I've never heard anybody say that insider trading isn't a bad thing. And that's good because it's an interesting opinion to take. Are things like the Enron scandal also totally just unenforceable, undetectable?
I don't know. I just don't know enough about the facts of those. That I do not know whether present government mechanisms for trying to get accurate information on companies do good or harm. I don't know. It's not a subject I know very much about.
And
notice that this isn't the sort of thing that's inherently hard for markets to solve, in the sense that in order for me to get you to invest in my company, I've got to persuade you that it's worth doing. So any terms about public information on the company that investors really care about, it's going to be in my interest to agree to and let you enforce in order to get your investment. That doesn't mean I can't fool you, obviously, there are various ways in which people can con other people, but you don't have an equivalent. In the case of air pollution, I don't need your consent in order to pollute your air. But I do need your consent in order to swindle you via bad investment. That makes it a problem that it is much easier to deal with by voluntary mechanisms.
Now, we could talk about the military, but I think that just given the time we have left, we might shift gear to something.
I have two chapters, one in the first edition, one in the third edition, sketching ways you might be able to fund the military. But I think that's the hardest problem because it's the public good. Because if I spend money on protecting the country from being invaded by whoever might invade us, Russia, I suppose, that the benefit gets shared by everybody else in the country. But we don't have to discuss that. As I say, people can look at the chapters. The third edition of Machinery is webbed on my webpage, so people can read it for free if they want.
Okay, great. And I will, of course, be mentioning all of that in the introduction. But the question that I had is, do we have any good indications from history that this sort of comprehensive anarcho-capitalist system would be successful?
We don't have anything that is equivalent to what it would be in a modern developed society. We have multiple examples of societies in which law enforcement was in effect private. And I have a chapter in the Legal System's Very Different book on what I call feud law. I should warn you, the word feud and the word feudal have no connection. They're etymologically distinct and conceptually distinct. The basic rule of feud law is that if you wrong me, I demand you compensate me, and if you don't compensate me, I harm you. And then there are a variety of requirements to make that a working legal system. And I run through in the chapter the problems it has to, first problem it has to solve is some reason why it works when you've really wronged me and doesn't work when I only pretend you wronged me, so that it's actual law enforcement rather than extortion. The second problem is some way of committing me so that when you say, if you harm me, I'll harm you back, I still go ahead and do it. And the third way is some way of protecting people who don't have the assets to do force themselves. And I discuss in the chapter the ways in which various real societies over the last 1,000 years or so have solved those problems. Imperfectly, of course. All human societies are imperfect.
Mm-hmm. When I spoke with Deirdre, we talked about equality of permission under the law, equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. And these are a number of closely related ideas, but maybe I should start with wealth inequality. Do you not see a totally unfettered free market as increasing wealth inequality to an inordinate degree, or is this something that you just accept?
No, I can't predict. It might increase it, it might decrease it. That, wealth inequality in our society, a lot of it is driven by government programs, that you have, restrictions for entry to various professions, which push up the wages of the people doing those professions. You have one of the sort of striking facts that nobody seems to realize. If you look at a graph of poverty rate in the U.S., starting basically at the end of World War II, which is where we have the data, from the end of World War II to about the point when the war on poverty got fully funded and manned, poverty rate is falling fairly sharply. From then on, it's been roughly constant. Roughly. I mean, obviously it goes up and down with economic conditions. But the theory of the war on poverty was that it was going to make people no longer poor, that it was going to get people permanently out of poverty. And it was entirely unable to do that in the various ways it tried. And what it ended up doing instead was making poverty somewhat less unpleasant by giving people money and things of that sort. And that's where it stayed. So my guess is that if you had a free market, you would have many fewer restrictions on people making money, including poor people. That, for example, there's no particular reason why being a barber should require a license. And yet in, I think, most cities it does. And the license requires things like 200 hours of classes on cutting hair. Well, being a barber is the sort of thing that a poor person who's reasonably competent can do. But it's illegal. And there are lots of other things in which that's the case. The only organization I actually normally donate money to is the Institute for Justice. And one of the things they do is to sue to knock down restrictions of that sort. But they have not knocked down anything like all of them. So there are various ways in which the government keeps people poor and makes people rich. There are various ways in which government keeps people from being rich. So I really can't predict whether you would end up with more or less income inequality. But I don't really regard income inequality as a bad thing. I regard poverty as a bad thing. But if the change is that the poor get 10% richer and the rich get 50% richer, that's a net gain, not a net loss.
So adopting anarcho-capitalism entails accepting that some people may, and I stress this, you don't want to predict, but I'll stress this word may, end up totally poor, homeless, healthy, and uneducated.
I'm not sure if you've noticed, but people do end up, quite a lot of people in our present society end up poor, uneducated, and homeless.
That's true.
The number of homeless, the homeless is to a significant degree a government creation because of the fact that very cheap housing is illegal. If you read Orwell, for example, on Down and Out in London and Paris, or Paris and London, I'm not sure how he orders it, he describes how very poor people lived in London when he was a pretty poor person. And it was basically in buildings where you had multiple people per room sleeping. Those would be illegal in probably any state, any city in the U.S. And they were cheap. Some of them were charitable. Some of them were, I think he actually said that he thought that he enjoyed the ones that were not charitable better than the ones that were charitable, because the ones that were charitable were religious and were trying to reform you as well as to house you. And there are all sorts of restrictions on housing construction in the U.S. at present. So I think that you would have almost certainly less homelessness. You would have the people who are now homeless. Well, some of them are homeless because they're crazy people who couldn't manage a home anyway. But the people who are homeless because they cannot afford a roof over their heads would have homes, but they would be very poor homes. They would be, look, in the Soviet Union under Stalin, in Moscow, you had people living a family to a room. That's a home. It's a very cheap home. And you would have something like that at the very low end. That problem, but you would certainly have poor people, and you will surely have uneducated people, but then we do now. And you would have rich people, and we have that now as well.
But in the current case, there are nonetheless, government-funded shelters and support. And I'm asking if anarcho-capitalism accepts that there could be people like this, homeless and unhealthy, without any supports, if there are not enough people with the necessary funding willing to support them.
Correct. That is, I think that if my guess is that a rich society, there is enough emotional feeling about people not starving that I think, and food is pretty cheap, that in the kind of society I imagine, I think it is very unlikely that anybody would be starving because they couldn't get any food, because there would be people who thought, wouldn't it be neat, our church or our club or something will. It happens at the present. My wife's every month or two, my wife bakes a whole bunch of bread for a project for the homeless that's run by local churches. And that doesn't depend on the government. And I expect that would still happen, probably happen more if the government weren't purportedly solving the problem. But it's certainly logically possible. It is logically possible that if you have no government, that some people will starve to death. It is logically possible that if you have a government, some people will starve to death. As it happens, all of the cases we know of large numbers of people starving were places with very strong governments, right? We have three of them. Soviet Union, where Holodomor starved a couple of million Ukrainians to death. This may be one reason why Ukraine is not really fond of being Russian. You have China, where the Great Leap Forward, current estimates are about 30 million people dying, although there's some dispute about that. And you have Cambodia, which holds the record for its percentage of the population, where I don't know what the total numbers are, but a very large number of people died. Those are all cases where the government was in charge of handling food. And you don't observe that in I guess the only case I can think of in the last couple of centuries within a basically capitalist system would be the Irish potato famine. And that was largely dealt with by Irish leaving Ireland and coming to America, which was a sensible thing to do under the circumstances. But that was a case where it wasn't because people were poor, it was because there had been a disease that wiped out a large part of the main food that the people relied on.
The two biggest problems that struck my mind, we already discussed, and those are global warming / pollution, and then total wealth inequality. But maybe it is worth bringing back the military into things, and not necessarily even the military, but humans are naturally hierarchical and power seeking. And I wonder if you don't think that in an anarchic world, groups like the mafia or the church or gangs would immediately attempt to consolidate powers, or maybe you just see this as another logical possibility, but not a pressing one.
Yeah, I don't see any particular reason to expect they would succeed in that. That after all, if you really want to do that sort of thing, the first thing you do is to bribe the police, and the judges. There's a book the last testament of Lucky Luciano. Luciano was a major organized crime figure back a ways. And the book claims to have been told to a newspaper man by Luciano when he was in retirement in Italy. And I believe it, but you can't prove whether it's real. It could have been invented by the guy. But one of the bits that struck me was that at one point he's running a criminal firm. And they're a group of maybe 4 or 5 criminal firms, and they're all independent, except they have a pooled fund for buying judges. Because that's something where there's an economy of scale. So the present system, the system that I advocate, if a rights enforcement agency or a court system is doing a bad job of protecting people's rights, then you would expect that those people will go to a different seller and it will lose money, and therefore it has an incentive to try to make sure that people aren't taking bribes. There is no comparable mechanism in our system.
Well, then the last sort of major cluster of topics I wanted to talk about were more practical. And generally, how would this be achieved? Because it seems like, if anything, the United States and other Western countries are becoming increasingly socialist and government is growing larger. Is the only possible full-scale violent revolution,
no.
Or how do you see this happening?
Violent revolution is probably a mistake from a libertarian standpoint, because a large part of the reason people want a government is to protect themselves against violence. So if there's lots of violence going around, they're likely to be willing to tolerate more government, not less. No, I think that what you want to do is to gradually reduce the size of government, and there are a whole bunch of different ways in which you get people to do that. One of them is what we're doing at the moment, that is trying to spread ideas using the internet or writing books or teaching classes or whatever, so that you can try to persuade, try to change. I like to say that the democratic political system is like an old-fashioned microscope with 2 knobs, a fine control and a coarse control. And the fine control is lobbying, basically. The coarse control is democratic voting by ignorant voters, because there's no incentive for the voter to actually have the information he needs to do a good job voting, since he's not the one who bears most of the cost if he makes the mistake. And therefore, one way of changing things is to change what ignorant people know. So putting out ideas. I actually had a Substack post about this maybe a month or 2 ago, called, I think, How to Save the World, pretentious title, but discussing ways, and it can be done for good or bad reasons. I gave an example of a particular case of somebody putting out ideas into the public where it happened to be a lie, but it was a well-tailored lie and lots of people believed it. I try to have ways in which I can embody an argument or an idea in a way that is simple and memorable. And I have a standard example of that, which is growing Hondas. The fact that you can we have 2 different technologies of producing automobiles. You can build them in Detroit or you can grow them in Iowa. And the way you grow cars in Iowa is to grow the raw material they're made out of, which is called wheat, put it on a ship, send the ship into the Pacific, and it comes back with Hondas on it. That's a technology for producing cars just as much as the other one is. And what that tells you is that what an auto tariff is doing is not protecting American auto workers from the competition of Japanese auto workers. It's protecting American auto workers from the competition of American farmers. So that's an example of an easy argument to follow, which, if enough people understand it, will make it politically a little more expensive to pass tariffs. And trying to do that kind of thing is one approach. A different approach is trying to create institutions that replace government. So, for example, if somebody could come up with a really inexpensive technology for private schooling, which ought to be possible now that we've got the internet and computers, at the point when you can get as good an education of your kids for $200 a year as the public school can for $12,000, there's going to be a big shift. Well, there will be a shift towards homeschooling and similar arrangements. Not perfect, because the public schools are largely doing babysitting anyway, and you need a substitute for that as well. But my point is just that the more you can produce adequate private substitutes, the less the pressure for people to want the government. And you can, in various ways, try to spread ideas. You might succeed, you might fail. I mean, the socialists managed to do it pretty successfully a century plus ago, and maybe we can do it too. But no, I think a revolution is not a very likely method. You do know, by the way, that at the moment, the leading presidential candidate in Argentina is not only a libertarian, but describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist. It's quite fascinating. We'll see what happens. He's an economist, too.
Well, talking about the spread of ideas, just to close, is your motivation in thinking, talking, and writing about this for the past many decades based on your interest in the theory and an obsession with that? Or are you really just more deeply invested in seeing change in politics and economics, like with this Argentine?
I'm in favor of change, but I think my main incentive is that it's fun. That thinking through ideas is something I enjoy doing. And there's a certain sense in which I feel that sort of the way I pay for the amount of space I take up in the universe is by creating new and good ideas. So, no, I hope it'll improve things, but I wouldn't have said that that's my main motive. And I've never been a professional libertarian. I'm a professional economist. So from that standpoint, a good deal of my work, my specialty for, I guess the last 30 years or so of my career was economic analysis of law. And that has some relevance to libertarianism and to anarcho-capitalism, but mostly it's a matter of trying to solve a puzzle, of trying to say, if you wanted to make a economically efficient legal rule, what would it be? And there's a whole literature on that. And I've got one book, which is my book, Law's Order, is essentially my contribution to that literature. And I do other things for fun.
Yes, you're an anachronist. I saw. I'd never heard of this before. Maybe
That's
our listeners
funny
haven't
because
either.
there's an SCA group in your area, at least has been, probably still is. Society for Creative Anachronism is people who do medieval and Renaissance stuff for fun, basically. And I and my wife and daughter are very much involved with researching medieval recipes, for example. We've got my wife and I have a cookbook you can get on. You can get it, download it from my webpage, but you can also buy it on Amazon, which has about 300 recipes from basically, I guess the earliest source is probably 5th century or so, and the latest is some early 17th century recipes. And for each of the recipes, we have the original and then how we do it, because originals, medieval recipes, tend to leave out a lot of details that you need, such as temperatures, quantities, temperatures, and times. But I do other things. I make a certain amount of historical jewelry. I've just been working on a tent based on some early tents, various other things. And that's been an entertaining hobby. And I do storytelling, which sit around a campfire telling medieval stories.
Well, I am an identified foodie, so you've piqued my interest. What are some of these recipes?
Say there are a lot of them. Let me see.
Well, there's 300 of them, but
yes. Let me describe one of the very, very simple things that we make and that's very popular. It's gingerbread. Only it's not what we call gingerbread at all, because it's not baked. What you do is you boil honey. You stir into it breadcrumbs. You add spices, specifically ginger, long pepper, and Saunders. Saunders is ground sandalwood root used as a food coloring, mainly in the Middle Ages. You knead it smooth as soon as it gets cool enough so you can handle it. You then put it out. I generally have wooden discs I've cut that I can spread it onto because that makes it easy to cut it. And you plant it with cloves. Stick cloves in it, ornamentally if you can, which I mostly try to do. and you then let it sit, and it'll last for a very long time if you don't eat it. And small kids like it, and so do most grown-ups. It's a sort of a candy kind of thing. Not what the texture is more like fudge than it is like what we call gingerbread, but it's a honey and ginger and to some extent long pepper flavored fudge. So that would be one example. Let me give you an entirely different example of something we're also fond of. I'm going to give a couple of those. There's a recipe which I got from an Icelandic medical miscellany, but it turns out that that's one of several daughter manuscripts from a lost original, and the person who researched them thinks the original was Southern European, even though Iceland is where it ended up. But it's a very simple recipe. You cut a chicken in half. You mix up a flour and water dough, essentially a bread dough, but not a raised bread dough. You divide the dough in half, roll out each half. You then wrap the half chicken in sage, bacon, and bread dough, and bake it in the oven like bread. And it comes out quite tasty. Especially the dough underneath has gotten soaked with chicken fat and bacon fat, and it's very, very yummy. Third example, another thing we make fairly often, Islamic. The first two I gave are both European, but we've got a lot of Islamic things, and I've been doing more of those recently because some very good cookbooks got translated. And there's something called rishta, and you take lamb, lentils, chickpeas, and half a stick of cinnamon, and you simmer them. You then you knead a dough from flour and water, roll it out thin, and cut it into noodles. You dump the noodles into the simmering lamb, lentils, chickpea liquid to cook the noodles, and you then eat it. And let me give you one more example for a dessert, which I haven't given. Well, gingerbread isn't really a dessert; it's a nibble. But I have several of what I think of as frying pan pastries, meaning that I can do them in a frying pan over a campfire without an oven, and yet get something which seems like a pastry. And one of them is Islamic. You make a very sticky semolina sourdough, and you fry a pancake. Turn over the pancake. Smear the cooked side with the sticky sourdough. Turn over the pancake. Smear the cooked side with the sticky sourdough. Turn over the pancake. So when you're finished, you've got, in effect, 10 layers of pancakes, all of which were at one point on the surface, and therefore all of which have been cooked, even though you don't have an oven in order to do a thick pastry. You then turn it up on its edge and roll it around like a wheel just to make sure you get any soft bits, any bits that didn't get properly cooked initially. You then put it flat, punch holes in it with the handle of a wooden spoon, and pour in melted butter and honey.
Oh, wow. That one sounds particularly interesting. It's funny. I mean, as I'm listening to this, I was just thinking, we tend to think implicitly that we in the present are at the pinnacle, whether it's morality, physics, economic theory, to name some of the things we've talked about. But and the same goes for our cultural sophistication. But this pancake has been lost to time.
But it isn't just that. The very fact that places like India and China have cuisines that we like is evidence that economic development does not have a strong correlation with good cooking. Right? India 20 years ago, 40 years ago, had good food. India was a relatively primitive country, and they didn't get the good food from the English. That would have been the worst place to look for it. But so anyway, so no, I don't see any particular evidence that the average quality of, obviously with quality of ingredients has improved because, we've got good transportation and freezers and a bunch of other things. But I don't think that the quality of the recipes has improved. It's just it's multiple different cuisines. It's medieval Islamic and English French, which is roughly one cuisine from about the 13th through the 15th century, and then starts changing somewhat in the 16th century, and so forth.
But in general, you find these recipes, even if they come from 800, 1,000 years ago, still to be highly palatable?
Yes. One of the interesting questions is many people believe, I think mistakenly, that medieval food was very overspiced. And if the standard story, which is obviously nonsense, is it was overspiced to hide the taste of rotten meat. And given that rotten meat gets you sick, and that spices were very expensive and the meat was available alive on the hoof, that is a very implausible story. Next question is it overspiced? And when somebody tells you that story, you ask him how he knows. Because most of the recipes, less true of the Islamic, but most of the European recipes don't have quantities. So what you can see is that they use a different palette of spices than we do, but not. They use ginger, for example, in some things that are not dessert kinds of things. Or cinnamon would be a better example. The fact that there was cinnamon in the rishta that I described, the noodle dish, and in fact, it turns out that I don't know if it's really the origin of the belief, but one of the earliest things available was a book called Two 15th Century Cookery Books, which was published by the Early English Text Society in the late 19th century. And the introduction to that has the comment that we can see that our ancestors had strong stomachs from the cinnamon soup on page X. You go to look at page X, and it's not a recipe, it's a menu. So his evidence for the fact that they had strong stomachs was that they sometimes had cinnamon in their soup. And this tells us more about English 19th century cooking than it does about medieval cooking.
I think I had always I've never thought about this before, but I had always just assumed that food must have gotten better and it must have been bad 1,000 years ago. But I imagine that it's less like physics, where we have certainly gotten better at physics, and more maybe like clothing, fashion. Fashion
or
has
poetry,
changed.
Or literature. Shakespeare was quite a long time ago, and yet people seem to think highly of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, techniques have evolved since Shakespeare, just like cooking techniques or cooking techniques, music, whatever. But that doesn't mean that we're better now. We might have more tools available to us.
Are our current musicians better than Bach?
Probably not.
Yeah, I'm not a music person, but my impression is most people think not. In terms of just technology, one of my interests is jewelry. The Etruscans, this is pre-Roman, are making granulated jewelry, gold where the pattern is done with little tiny gold spheres arranged on it, with the granules 1/300th of an inch across. They were doing that like 2,700 years ago, roughly.
Do you wear a lot of jewelry, or
No,
you just
I don't wear
making
jewelry.
it?
I make jewelry for my wife and my daughter, and to show other people, and occasionally give other people, but not very often.
So you enjoy maybe the aesthetics, the craft, and the history, but you don't want to wear it.
Yeah, I don't wear jewelry, but yeah, no, I enjoy. First, I do lapidary work, mostly for the fun of it. That is cutting gemstones, and that's mostly just because they're very pretty and it's fun to see something come alive, as it were. But I also do fairly simple constructions, soldering and cutting and stuff with silver sheet and wire. And at least part of what I'm doing is trying to see if I can successfully reproduce medieval things, or something close to medieval things. And that's fun. And there's a annual big SCA event held north of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with about 10,000 people at it. I teach classes there and things like how to do medieval jewelry.
Very cool. Well, I'm so glad that we finished the last 10 or 15 minutes on anachronism, because I didn't know about it, and it seems like there are many dimensions of it.
If you look on my webpage, there is a book my wife and I self-published called The Miscellany, which is 300 and some pages long, also available from Amazon, but you can download it PDF from the webpage. And part of it is our recipes, And part of it is my SCA poetry and instructions on making a medieval pavilion and a whole bunch of other stuff of that sort. So you can get at least some feeling of the SCA, at least through my eyes, from that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me on so many levels. It was really fun.
Thank you.
Hold on. If you haven't subscribed, liked, commented, or reviewed, that would be so helpful. And if you haven't yet, you could also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Robinson Earhart.